What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to driving. It is Friday, and I've been busting my tail all week, and I'm gonna go take a lunch break at the range. So on the way, we are going to take one of your questions from the last video like this, from the comment section, and we are going to answer that question today. Now, if you would like your question answered in a video like this of its very own, you can ask a question in the comments of this video, and then I will answer it in the next one. That's how that's going to work. For those of you that are new to the channel, do me a favor and like and subscribe and all the things. And go to Dylan Talks Tone and check out pickup stuff and all that. So here is the question while I sit at this very long red light. How does the pickup's resistance affect its sound? For instance, the same P90 wound for 7K, 8K, 9K, how much resistance change is required to make a noticeable difference in tone or loudness? Interesting. All right. So, this is the kind of questions that I'm looking for, right? Kind of back to basic stuff, kind of just general theory stuff. It's kind of fun, especially for those of you that are not super familiar with this stuff. So, here's the thing we need to understand about resistance of a pickup. The resistance of a pickup is basically only helpful when you are, it's a general help, okay? So a 7K pickup, for example, is not as high output as a 9K or a 10K or a 14K, right? That's generally what we know. The problem is that measurement and that association between those two pickups is only really a thing if all things in the pickup are the same except for the amount of wire on the bottom. What I mean by that is, so let's take the P90 example. And he said 7K, 8K, and 9K. Now, typically on that pickup, that would be probably a 42 gauge wire. If the magnets were exactly the same, so Alnico 5, let's call it, on a P90. Of course, it's a P90, so the dimension of the coil doesn't change, right? Because it's just still a P90. So the only thing, there's two things that you could change to change the resistance of the pickup. One would be the wind count. Okay, so we could go from, to get those, you would probably go from somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000 to 10,000 to 11,000. That's not exact. I would have to do the math, but just off the top of my head, just to give you an idea, our pickups are usually about 8.2K, and they're wound to 10,000 winds with 42. So to get 1K less, it's probably in the neighborhood of 9,200 winds, and then to get an extra K on top would be somewhere in the neighborhood of probably, I don't know, 10,800, something like that. So there's a couple of kind of variables that are interesting in this conversation. One is the more you wind on the pickup, the less winds it takes to make a difference because the winds get longer. So that's a weird thing to say, but when you first start winding the pickup, the windings are smaller. And when you get to the end of the pickup, the windings are bigger because it's going further and further around, right? So if we just keep everything exactly the same and we vary it by 800 to 1,000 winds, chances are most people in most circumstances will hear very little difference. Now, if you go from 7,000, like 7K to 9K, right? If you go from 7 to 8, most people in most circumstances will not hear difference. You go from 8 to 9, most people in most circumstances will not hear much of a difference. If you go from 7 to 9, now that's a bigger jump. Now if we go from 7 to 9, a couple things can happen. One is the overall output volume of the pickup can be louder because you're actually making more voltage. Remember, with a guitar pickup, you're actually making electricity. It's literally the opposite of an electric motor. Okay, so you're literally motion of the strings, making electricity. The more winds, for lack of a better term, the more winds, the more electricity you can make. So the more overall output can be made. However, the more winds also introduce more resistance, which shaves high frequencies, which even if you have more output, can shave off effective volume because the mid-range starts to go away. So yes, you can make more volts, you can make more electricity, but depending on how you do it, you might not actually make more volume. But what it will do is it will compress the amp harder. So if we go from 7 to 8, from 8 to 9, we may not hear much volume difference, but what we might hear, especially on a P90, is we might hear, let's say we're playing through a Princeton or a Blues Junior, something very low wattage. Then we could start to hear different compression characteristics, pushing the tubes a little differently. Or if you have a very good modeler, it will simulate that as well. So you'll hear more tonal change, not so much tonal change, so much as how it hits the amplifier, right? You're going to hear those differences probably before you hear an actual tonal change. Now, the other way we can fix this, or to do this, is I could say, all right, well, I could probably go about the same amount of winds, but then just go from 42 gauge to 43 gauge wire, which is a thinner wire. So thinner wire has a higher resistance per foot. So it wouldn't be 1-to-1, but it would be pretty close. If you went from 10,000 winds of 42 to 10,000 winds of 43, would get you somewhere around these numbers that we're looking for to go from 8 to 9. It's not, I would have to do the math and figure it out, but it's somewhere around there. Now here's where you might start to hear a little bit of a tonal difference. Because you'll end up hearing more of a high frequency drop off and a mid-range cut and shift. Okay, that's typically what you're going to hear when we go to a smaller smaller wire gauge. Smaller wire gauge is going to flatten out the tone of the pickup. It's going to take away that mid-range hump, and it's going to take away that clarity, and it's going to give you more scoopy stuff. It's going to just give you a, I don't like it. I think it's kind of flat or something. So you could go from 8K to 9K by changing the wire gauge, and now you're going to start to hear some tonal differences. And it's still going to compress the amp more. So it just depends on how you want to do it. So when somebody says to me, wind me a hotter pickup, usually what that means is they want to be heard. They want to be louder because they're playing with some friends and they can't be heard. For some reason they're not being heard for something, whatever. Typically a hotter pickup doesn't fix that, because in both of the circumstances that we mentioned, we have more compression with a higher wind count, which gives us less clarity also. It depends on your amp and stuff, but in most cases, to be heard, higher output isn't always the answer, depending on who you're playing with, right? In the last video, we talked a lot about understanding sonic space, and that's what's really important. So, does it matter? Absolutely. Does it make a difference? Absolutely. But there's so many different ways to do it that there isn't one right answer. So when somebody calls me and says, or emails me or gets me in the chat on the website and says, look man, I've got these Gibson pickups, or I've got these Epiphone pickups, these P90s, or I've got these Reverend P90s, and this is what I want. I want hotter pickups. Well, what do you actually want? Do you want to be heard, or do you want hotter pickups? Do you want to compress the amp, or what do you actually want? I try to discuss those goals with you, because typically 99% of the time, buy our P90s, the stock ones that we make, buy our stock P90s, put them in your guitar, and you're going to get more voltage, more clarity, more mid-range, and you're going to be heard in a mix much better than with your box stock P90s that you have in your guitar already, without getting hotter. Oh, can you wind me a hotter one? I need to be hotter. Probably not. You probably actually don't need to be hotter. So yeah, but great question, because it's just a really important thing to understand that more output is going to compress more resistance is going to shave highs and mid-range, right? So it's not always the best thing. When is it a good thing? When you've engineered the sound that way the entire way, right? When you have a guitar, so it's not to say high output pickups are bad. I've got that Schecter MGK that's got 15K pickups in it, but that guitar is the whole thing's sort of engineered to sound high output, and it's made to fit in a particular kind of mix. So what I would recommend is make sure that you're not trying to take your pickup sound and put a square peg in a round hole, and really understand what you're trying to do with that guitar. And I can help you with that. When you call me or email me on the chat or email me on the website, I can help you with that. We can figure that out. That was a great question. Anyway, it could be really kind of overly complicated. You could get super in the weeds with it. But for the sake of these videos, I like to try to just get back down to the basics of you don't always need higher output. Don't always. All right, if you have a question that you want to have answered like this, and sort of get nerded out about it a little bit, put it in the comment section of this video. I will go through them, and then we will answer them next week. Thanks for hanging out, and we will see you in the next video. Like and subscribe and do all the things that you do, and we'll talk to you next time. I'm still trying to figure out what to call this, because I think I am going to actually drive around as we do these things. It just makes more sense. So what should we call this? We'll see you.